Hi everyone, welcome to this fourth video lecture for Digital Hermeneutics. In the past weeks, we've talked about all these radical shifts in hermeneutics, moving from Christian translation of godly texts to the romanticism of getting to know the author, to different kinds of formalism, to the analysis of the structures of language, and finally the undoing of those structures by the post-structuralists. One part of the story I've left out, and that is the story about the existential philosophers and their influence on hermeneutics. This week is about that story. So this is basically another story of 20th century hermeneutics. We first discuss Edmund Husserl and his Phenomenology. We then turn to ontological hermeneutics through Heidegger, and then have a look at some of the black existentialists such as Bois, Fanon and Cooper. We start, as always, a few steps backwards in time. Edmund Husserl was Wilhelm Dilthey's contemporary. You'll recall from week 1 that Dilthey was trying to say something about history, about the historical preconditions of our understanding, and that you need different methods in the humanities to do so, to understand something instead of trying to explain it. Like Dilthey, Husserl is trying to offset himself against the positivism of his age. He calls it very scornfully Tatsachenwissenschaft, a science of factoids. And the route he took in order to think about an alternative to this kind of science is a different one to the one that Dilthey took. It has to do with a kind of knowledge about our own consciousness, and it's called Phenomenology. Now, this is a method that would come to influence the whole of continental philosophy in the next century. It's really the blatantly missing element in our overview of continental philosophy so far. With Husserl, hermeneutics becomes a proper philosophical issue, because there's suddenly much more at stake than just understanding texts. We need to understand ourselves and our experiences. So, what's the main claim of phenomenology? It is that rather than empirical data, it is mental experience that is the source of all knowledge. Husserl was highly critical of positivism and what he called the natural attitude. And it's a bit paradoxical because he says we need to go back to the things themselves, zurück zu den Sachen selbst. And you might think, well, isn't that precisely what the natural sciences do, Mr. Husserl? I mean, they are interested in phenomena which we can simply get to know if we embark on sort of a positivist mission. So what does Husserl mean? Well, his project was about those things that we are surrounded with, but the point is that the distinction between those things and the way in which we get to know them is a bit more complex than it seems. It's really a fundamental question. How can you understand something? Husserl asked, isn't it peculiar that everything around us makes sense to us? Our consciousness, our minds, they are in contact with something else. They seem to be targeted by the world. He calls this intentionality, which means that all of our thoughts are naturally directed towards objects. Thoughts are always about objects, whether that's an actual object or another person or a memory, whatever. To sum it up, there is a correlation between the subject and the object. Note that this resembles the ideas of Hegel that we spoke of 2 weeks ago, this idea that we as humans are actually in contact with the world, in a philosophical sense, that we are in some sense worldly. So intentionality is much more than just someone's intention to do things, which is how we typically use the term. With Husserl, you can say, I intended to score that goal, but you can also say, I intended this large mammal in the field as a cow. Both are the same kind of act, directing our minds towards things. In other words, we're always thinking of some object as being a certain kind of thing. You didn't just enter this room that you're sitting in right now. You entered it and immediately thought of the room as hot or well lit or rustic or cleaned up or whatever. We are always characterizing the things we think of. We don't see them in a vacuum. So what Husserl then tries to do is come up with a systematic theory of intentionality. And what Husserl tries to do then is to come up with a systematic theory of intentionality. That's what he means with phenomenology. Husserl says that in order to describe things phenomenologically, you should always speak from a first-person point of view, because that's really all you can embark from. And really, he wants us not to move beyond that structure of the experience itself. We simply cannot know whether those thoughts are actually tracking objects and events in the world. So he draws the conclusion that all our judgments about the external world should be suspended. He calls this phenomenological reduction, or epoché, bracketing, putting things between brackets. What we are bracketing is this natural attitude that wants to ascertain the real existence of particular objects. So when Husserl says that we are in contact with the world, he doesn't mean that in the positivist scientific sense. The other reduction we ought to do, Husserl notes, is what he calls eidetic reduction. That means reducing your thoughts to the essence of subjective experience. As he puts it, that without which an object of a particular kind cannot be thought. You see that he's a logician here because he's thinking about something like geometric shapes. So what you have to do, he notes, is focus on a kind of object, say a triangle, and you then systematically try to take out certain features of that triangle. What you then need to reflect on at each step is whether the object remains the same kind of object in spite of these altered features. So each time the object survives some imaginary feature alteration, you can reveal that feature as inessential. On the other hand, if you remove a feature and the object ceases to be of the same kind, so say by adding a fourth side to a triangle, the decisive thing that happens is that the triangle resists this operation. It is at that moment that the phenomenon demonstrates itself, shows its evident truth. That is how you now know that it's an essential element. So, eidetic reduction is this finding essences through free variation, imagining different variations of the phenomenon to see what remains as its essential aspects. Now, of course, the problem is these sorts of universal aspects are quite problematic when you start dealing with things that are a bit more complex than geometric shapes. And all the phenomenologists after Husserl pointed this out. Still, this putting things in between brackets is important. Ever since Husserl, hermeneutics has consisted, for an important part, on reflecting on one's own boundaries, exposing the baggage of the interpreter, in order for the text to become more autonomous, can come to speak to us. This story of phenomenology and the essence of things and the focus on one's own understanding continues with Martin Heidegger. And we will see hermeneutics properly take on this new form that Husserl had imagined. With Heidegger, hermeneutics becomes a proper ontological concern. It's related to being, to existence, and not just literature. Heidegger, as you may know, is a very controversial figure. He began as Husserl's academic assistant, but they gradually moved away from each other. The reason for this controversiality is that in 1933, Heidegger joined the Nazi Party. They were actually responsible for him becoming rector at the University of Freiburg. Some say he enthusiastically implemented their Nazi policies. Others say he only allowed the policy to be implemented while conducting an underground campaign of resistance. But his so-called black notebooks, written between 1931 and 1941 and published in 2014, didn't help his case very much. A lot of passages reveal a particularly unsettling kind of anti-Semitism, one which wasn't fully visible before. Not only did Heidegger hold very ignorant anti-Semitic beliefs, he wrote about a worldwide conspiracy of calculating Jews. He also tried to formulate a philosophical kind of anti-Semitism. Do these private ideas make Heidegger an anti-Semitic philosopher? Do these notebooks show his true colors? To make these matters even more complicated, it's very hard to tell whether the philosophical works Heidegger wrote were cleansed of anti-Semitic content by his editors. Heidegger gave up his rectorship in 1934, possibly under pressure from faculty members who resented the Nazis' influence, and over time his reservations deepened. It's often said that Heidegger kind of wandered into Nazism, daftly egotistical. Only when he realized that the Nazis didn't agree with him philosophically, he sort of pulled away. After the war, he said privately that his participation in the movement had been the biggest stupidity of my life. And yet, Heidegger never truly apologized for being a Nazi. Even worse, he never directly and publicly addressed the reality of the Holocaust before he died in 1976. It's impossible to unthink this, and it makes it harder, if not impossible, to care about Heidegger's ideas. Heidegger himself said that you need to care for something in order to really be able to know about it, and that goes here as well. At the same time, it's very hard to disavow Heidegger's thinking completely. It's too useful and it's too influential. His thoughts have been central to the direction that philosophy took in the 20th century. So I will leave the decision to engage with it further to you. Irrespective of his personal views, Heidegger's ontological turn in hermeneutics is still a complete transformation of the hermeneutic project. Suddenly, there's much more at stake. Hermeneutics is not a matter of understanding linguistic communication or about providing a methodological basis for the human sciences. As far as Heidegger is concerned, hermeneutics is ontology. It is about the most fundamental conditions of mankind's being in the world, as he calls it. Being and Time, his masterwork, is this very long, complex work filled with neologisms and hyphenations. Like Derrida, he seems to be struggling to say things for which conventional philosophical terms and linguistic constructions were inadequate. If that sounds radical, that's about right. Heidegger wanted nothing less than to rethink the entirety of the philosophical project. To him, this project had been corrupted from as early on as Plato. He was especially critical of Descartes and his typical Enlightenment theory of rationally establishing knowledge through propositions. Of course, using rationality to come to certain conclusions seems very rational, but to Heidegger it completely bypassed the most fundamental aspects of our existence in the world. To him, understanding is fundamentally pre-scientific and pre-propositional, as he called it. This is what hermeneutics to Heidegger are about.
Und das heißt zugleich für die abendländische Philosophie die Besinnung auf die Geschichte des abendländischen Denkens hat mir gezeigt, dass im bisherigen Denken eine Frage niemals gestellt wurde, nämlich die Frage nach dem Sein.
To Heidegger, the world is not some rationally analyzable thing out there, this idea that goes back all the way to Platonian metaphysics. Instead, he says, our consciousness is always already familiar with the world. Heidegger basically develops a language that tries to rid itself of the assumptions of the whole division between subject and object. As he himself explained, the self and the world belong together in a single entity, and that single entity he calls Dasein, or being in the world, as it's translated. What this means is that we have to project interpretation back onto ourselves. As you'll recall, Husserl wanted to come to an understanding of what he called transcendental conditions. So global conditions, conditions that apply to everyone. Heidegger actually doesn't accept that, and instead he starts following Wilhelm Dilthey. He says, no, understanding is historical. What we need to interpret is not the texts, but understanding itself. And this means interpretation is ceaselessly open to revision, enhancement, and replacement. So really, Heidegger wants us to rethink the question of existence and experience. Most of philosophy, basically from Plato onwards, asks a question about existence. Does that table exist? Does God exist? Does my mind exist? But these types of questions presuppose that we know what to exist even means. Like Husserl, Heidegger asks, what does to exist mean? How is it that entities are intelligible as entities? Heidegger thereby emphasizes that people exist not in a vacuum, but in the world. And that means, again, you'll hear Husserl here, that we can only understand ourselves and the world as being in the world. Now, that also means that understanding is not a willed and carefully conducted procedure. It's not something we do consciously. We do not understand the world by gathering a collection of neutral facts by which we reach some set of universal propositions or laws or judgments. Understanding, he says, is much more immediate, and the world is familiar to us in this basic, intuitive way. Heidegger calls this Vorverstehen, pre-understanding. Heidegger says, and I quote, we humans are always already in an environing world. With environing, he means that we all exist in this culturally and historically conditioned environment which we cannot step outside of. Existence is always set against a background that contextualizes experience. So, to Heidegger, phenomenology happens all around us, in that we are always already interpreting life. We can never really be detached from life. This might sound very abstract, but it could be a good idea to focus on this process of Vorverstehen, this idea of being in some way familiar with the things you're looking at. What does that mean in terms of your own analysis? In what ways are you familiar with the kinds of discussions or topics or communities that you're looking at in your analysis? Focus, for instance, on how it comes that something is intelligible to you at all. A shared interest, a cultural overlap, and so on. Or vice versa, focus on the things that might seem strange or even incomprehensible to you, but that seem intelligible or even straightforward to others. Again, you'll find a post in our discussions section where you can reflect on this. I think this kind of awareness is particularly relevant for social platforms such as Reddit, which are catering to your personal tastes and recommend similar content or communities in this case based on what it knows about your interests. The internet we currently have is formulated upon these ideas of similarity. We are nudged towards things that are similar to things that we already like, that we already know, that we already care for. The idea of Vorverstehen is related to Heidegger's ideas about practicality. And here again, he is going against this very eminent and obvious mental distinction, which is Descartes' distinction between subject and object. This distinction in which human subjects simply analyze the world of objects. Instead, Heidegger notes that we ordinarily encounter things in the world as what he calls equipment. That means things serve a certain task. Cutlery is for eating, pens are for writing, hammers are for building houses, and so on. Heidegger argues we achieve our closest relationship with equipment not through some detached intellectual or theoretical study of it, but rather by skillfully manipulating it in a hitch-free manner. Heidegger calls these objects zu handen, or ready to hand in the English translation. The opposite of that is vorhanden, or present at hand in English. What does he mean with that? You might call this a theory of flow, or of things just working. It, of course, conjures up all kinds of nasty images of marching armies, and harmony, and purification, and so on. But I think we can also read it a bit more favorably as the idea that we can go through most of life being completely oblivious to the things that simply work. Heidegger has a famous example, which is about the experience of the broken hammer. He says, to the carpenter, the hammer is zu handen, ready to hand, ready to be used, functioning as a tool, right? And the carpenter doesn't really consider its function as they use it. As soon as it breaks, however, this hammer suddenly materializes in all its uselessness, and it can then become something that is vorhanden, something that just sits there and that we can start to have all kinds of ideas about. I think this is relevant to our work. I mean, consider the breakdown of software. As long as the algorithm we use only transforms data, it may not be considered a hermeneutical thing at all. Remember the Apple advertisement slogan, "It just works"? Algorithms only become a matter of hermeneutics when they falter over some input and break down or start spewing inconsistent and unexpected results. It's typically only when your Python starts throwing errors that you actually go back and check out what's going on. This, by the way, is also why we have what's called sanity checks or sanity tests in programming. This basic test to evaluate whether a claim or the result of a calculation can possibly be true. For instance, when trying out a new programming environment, people sometimes use a Hello World program for this, where if it fails to compile or execute, we can say the supporting environment likely has a configuration problem. And if it does work, well, any problem that we're then diagnosing likely lies in the actual application in question. Now, that said, for someone like Heidegger, such sanity checks would certainly not be enough, as we only really start doing it when things are overtly off. Even if some script seems to work, we gotta wonder if that is really the case. If we're tracking what we think we're tracking, and if that which we're tracking actually helps us understand the matter at hand. Especially when we're dealing with formal computer language, right? Where we can only understand the hermeneutics of the machine in effect by looking at some transformation output. This kind of reflection is enormously important. So anyway, it's crucial to Heidegger that we understand those things that are close to us in their daily usefulness, instead of as disinterested objects of scientific explanation. This is why Heidegger is so critical of Descartes and other philosophers who think of understanding as something that is vorhanden. Heidegger famously said, Descartes shows us the world with its skin off, so as something scientifically observable from the outside. In one rather famous paragraph from Being and Time, he explains this position in different words. He says, what we first hear is never noises or complexes of sounds, but the creaking wagon, the motorcycle. We hear the column on the march, the north wind, the woodpecker tapping, the fire crackling. It requires a very artificial and complicated frame of mind to hear a pure noise. Okay, so what does this lead to in terms of hermeneutics? In terms of art, for instance? Well, Heidegger isn't really a fan of the way we look at art. The problem is, again, this object-subject worldview that dominates philosophy. Heidegger dismisses that we think of the artwork as an object and of ourselves as the subject who might feel a particular emotion about it. This ontological divide, to him, is what aesthetics has always concerned itself with, and it's wrong. We are used to confront art as something outside of our subjectivity. If we encounter an art form, we are supposed to just leave our subjectivity at the door, to encounter this external object and then return with the fruits of that labor to analyze it. This, to Heidegger, fits in the typically modern view of the world, which is permeated by science and technology. Modern humans are always trying to control every aspect of reality. The aesthetic mode, in that sense, is a very calculated and planned mode. Heidegger calls it enframing, in which everything becomes a resource. Now I'm going to look at art, we say. But Heidegger, who lived his whole life in rural Germany and didn't like the modern world very much, he said, no, our primary mode of engagement with art is much more direct and tacit. We are deeply entwined with the world. Looking at art while staying within this aesthetic approach is a bit like trying to learn how to ride a bicycle by staring at a broken bicycle. Finally, remember that to Heidegger, human experience is historical in that it fundamentally changes over time. The role of art in this is immense. Art embodies and reinforces a historical community's sense of what truly matters, which kinds of lives are most worth living, which actions are noble, and so on. In short, great art is capable to disclose or even transform our historical consciousness. Art can be revolutionary because it can shape our basic sense of what matters. That's why Heidegger notes art should become what he calls an object of lived experience. Finally, some words on how Heidegger returns to our infamous hermeneutic circle. Again, to Dilthey and Schleiermacher, the hermeneutic circle referred to the mutual relationship between the text as a whole and its individual parts, or between the text and historical tradition. But Heidegger understands this circle not just as a helpful tool to understand texts, but rather as part of the phenomenological project. He takes us into this equation. The whole is not the text, it's the world. Hermeneutics is about the interplay between our self-understanding and our understanding of that world. Heidegger's hermeneutic philosophy helps us to remember really quite a simple, very pragmatic aspect of interpretation, to not take ourselves as interpreting academics out of the equation. The innate familiarity that we have with the world is something that's both a requirement for interpretation and something that we constantly have to grapple with if we're trying to understand social phenomena objectively. Now, this all sets up the idea of the dialogue, which we will discuss in class when we discuss Hans-Georg Gadamer. Gadamer builds on Heidegger in order to say that you are always in a dialogue with the world around you, whether that's a text or another person or another. Gadamer builds on Heidegger's ideas in order to say that you are always in a dialogue with the world around you, whether that's a text or another person or another era or another culture. And that's what hermeneutics is. However, before we get to that, this idea of familiarity implies a sense of universality to human experience. And we've already encountered that idea of universality in the last few weeks. Perhaps we ought to wonder, well, does everyone really have an equal disposition when it comes to their familiarity with the world? What if that being in the world is marked by a fundamental hostility towards you? This is where we need to talk a bit about Black existential philosophy, also known as Africana critical theory. It shares concerns and themes with European existentialism, things like existence, consciousness, trepidation, meaninglessness, despair, and so on. But crucially, it breaks away from the uniqueness of the individual, as well as these universalist conceptions of humans and their obligation to their internal selves. It's still about inner life, about concerns with the lived reality of Black designated peoples, but it does connect these inner lives to a social reality of shared oppression. The mission of Africana critical theory is the liberation of all black people in the world from oppression. William Dubois was many things. He was an activist, a journalist, a historian, a sociologist, a novelist, a critic, a philosopher, but it's the problem of race that unifies all of his work. He was the first African American to earn a doctorate, and he taught history, sociology, and economics at Atlanta University. Dubois addressed several problems that would become central to Black existential philosophy. Essentially, he raised the question of Black suffering as a philosophical problem. He was trying to figure out if there was a meaning behind all this suffering. He observed that Black people were often studied and addressed in public discussions as problems of the modern world, instead of as people facing problems raised by modern life. For instance, in his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction in America, he challenged the prevailing idea that it was blacks who were responsible for the failures of the Reconstruction era. He argued that black people faced a lot of double standards in their efforts to achieve equality in the wake of enslavement, colonialism, and racial apartheid. This double standard produced contradictory experiences in the minds of black citizens. Dubois called these experiences two-ness and double consciousness. The two-ness was the experience of being both black and American, whereas these two were treated as contradictory by wider society. This resulted in what he called double consciousness. He viewed it as the result of being seen from a cultural perspective of anti-black racism, which resulted in a lowly and inferior self-image. This really opens up all kinds of existentialist points. Think of Sartre's hell is other people, to a proper analysis of racial power structures. For instance, this double consciousness is quite different to what Heidegger has in mind when he talks about fallenness. Fallenness also has to do with how we relate to the world around us and how the world around us constitutes us. Heidegger talks about things like idle talk, where we're sort of conversing in a very critically unexamined way about facts and information. And Heidegger says that being lost in this publicness prevents us from living authentically. However, that does presuppose that there is a way of relating more authentically to the being in the world. And to Heidegger, again, that has everything to do with turning inward instead of to the people around us. For Dubois and the black existentialists, this kind of private inward turn is something that marginalized and oppressed people simply cannot afford. Instead, they want us to recognize the injustice of a social system that limits possibilities for some groups and creates advantages for others, while at the same time expecting both to perform equally. Next is Frantz Fanon, an incredibly versatile thinker who included poetry, psychology, philosophy, political theory in order to engage in Black Atlantic theory. Fanon argued that the modern world didn't afford a model of a normal black adult. What it did afford is a series of pathologies of the black soul, which he calls a white construction. This problem placed black people in an alienated relationship with language, love, and even their inner dream life. The problem, to Fanon, is that black people are locked in blackness and white people are locked in whiteness. This is a crucial intervention into existential thinking. In Fanon's view, social structures create ontologies. They create ways in which we are able to exist. Again, you can't solve this problem by behaving authentically. For Fanon, colonialism is a total project. It leaves nothing untouched. This is where he discusses the role of language, which, as we've seen, constitutes experience. To speak a language, Fanon says, is to participate in the world and to adopt a civilization. This is his hermeneutic point, which we saw discussed by others as well. Language, subjectivity, and reality are essentially entangled. The colonial situation, again, makes this all the more complicated. If speaking a language means participating in a world, then the language of the colonized, a language imposed by centuries of colonial domination and dedicated to the elimination or at least abjection of other expressive forms, speaks the world of the colonizer. So, to speak as the colonized means to participate in one's own oppression and to reflect the very structures of one's own alienation. Fanon says the black person could learn to speak perfect French and sound like a very sophisticated Parisian. And if we take that linguistic point at face value, well, we'd say that might promise a certain kind of liberation from one's alienation, right? If the black colonial learns to speak as well as the white Parisian, perhaps there can be equal participation in the world. This, however, is where Fanon talks about the epidermal character of race. To be black and to speak with perfect diction means still to be black, and therefore marked as special and surprising and unique. In the opening chapter of his book, Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon describes the surprise of white French people at his articulateness. That surprise is to him a reminder of his inferiority. To Fanon, blackness that is honestly confronted with its condition in an anti-black world is a kind of hell. He calls it the zone of non-being. What makes things worse is that the anti-black world effectively hides this non-being by ascribing a place and a role to blackness through its colonial projects. However, like Dubois, Fanon does not describe the descent into this zone of non-being as nihilism or despair. Instead, he views it to be a crucial requisite for revolutionary power. And it has revolutionary potential precisely because the anti-black world is not able to contain or sustain the affirmation of black life, as being, as having a claim on the world. This is where Fanon's political project turns to the necessity of violence. Finally, let's discuss Anna Julia Cooper. She was an educator and an activist, and she published her best-known work called A Voice from the South by a Black Woman from the South in 1892. It has been called the first book-length black feminist text, and it takes an intersectional approach to examine the interlocking systems of race and gender and class oppression. Cooper demonstrates how black women are simultaneously or intersectionally impacted by racism and sexism. For these reasons, Cooper argues, black women have a unique epistemological standpoint from which to observe society and its oppressive systems, as well as a unique ethical contribution to make in confronting and correcting these systems. This is also where Dubois' idea of a double consciousness can, and in fact has been, extended. This is precisely what intersectionality is, the existence of multiple systems of oppression that lock people in their social place in life, and thus their subjectivities. Cooper also crucially focuses on the impossibility to understand these forms of subjectivity if you haven't lived them. Lewis Gordon has more recently argued that black existential philosophy is characterized by what he calls the lived context of concern. This is an anthropological argument. Any existential demand for understanding Africana people's being in the world needs to be raised by people who live that situation. For example, a slave's situation can only be understood through recognizing the fact that it is a slave who experiences it. A lot of contemporary identity politics, as they're called, take a cue from this, that experience is formed by particular social identities and that it's paramount to understand these experiences on their own accord. This is also why whitewashing in the film industry, where white actors are cast in non-white roles, began being regarded as a problem. So, to conclude, Black existentialism is about repurposing the language of existentialism and inner worlds to liberate the Black subject from pre-formulated language and meaning. It makes use of the existential question about what comes before scientific qualification and what constitutes the self in the world that it finds itself being born in. Again, this strongly problematizes the idea of universal experience. And I think it's a critique that today finds a lot of recognition. The question to which extent proper interpretive understanding of suffering is possible for people from completely different contexts of power is one that we all need to work through. This week in class, we are going to discuss that idea of dialogue through Gadamer's theory. I look forward to seeing you then.